computer. So, hello, good evening, I should say.
Hi, Julia.
Hello, Jonathan. And it's great to see you again. And it's lovely to be having this conversation with you right now. And I would first like to start with, if it's okay with you, with asking you this very basic and easy question, obviously. So, who are you, Jonathan? Who's Jonathan Leighton?
You said you'd be starting with an easy question.
Yes, an easy question for a Sunday. That's
yeah. Who am I? Yeah, it's interesting. I think during this whole coronavirus crisis, we're spending a lot of time with ourselves, and we can actually start putting our own selves into question. You know, who are we? What am I doing? What do I care about?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Who am I? Well, I'm a citizen of planet Earth who is trying to find some sort of balance between thriving and making a difference. And that, in a way, encapsulates my philosophy of life. This idea of making a difference, and when I say making a difference, as we'll be speaking about, I mean very specifically about reducing suffering in the world, and then at the same time trying to thrive, trying to enjoy life, find meaning in life, and I think this search for a balance between these two is, in some ways, it's sort of universal, and for me, this is sort of one of the messages I'm trying to communicate, that we can do both. We have a right to look after our own well-being, but in some sense, there's a responsibility to have as much impact as we can in the world to make it a better place for others.
So what is it that you do in order to thrive personally and to give meaning to your life and go beyond this individualized version of thriving and
right.
giving? Yeah.
So, I've been on my own journey to, first of all, try to understand what's going on in the world and to get a better sense of what it is we ought to be doing. That's sort of the question of ethics. What is it that I ought to be doing? And in fact, I think even that question can be rephrased, because the whole idea of ought presupposes that there is something that we ought to be doing. And so this is actually part of what I'm trying to do is understand what is ethics about, and reframe ethics in a way that is based less on certain kinds of words that we think have a lot of meaning that may not mean what they do, and really to sort of get down to the bottom of things in a sense. So since years ago, I've been thinking about this very basic question: what matters? And that was ultimately the main subject of a book I wrote, which came out several years ago, which The Battle for Compassion.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
And that was really an exploration. It was an exploration of that question, what matters, in the context of us being human beings living in this strange universe that runs according to the laws of physics. And basically I was trying to explore the whole notion of suffering and why I consider that suffering is the focus of ethics, or is logically the focus of ethics.
So why is it?
If
that's what you're saying.
Right, I guess there are different ways of looking at it, but
in your opinion,
a very simple way of looking at it is like this: in a sense, ethics is about trying to change things. We're trying to change the state of the world, either at the micro level or at the macro level. But we want
Mm-hmm.
things to go from A to B. We want to have impact. We want to
Mm-hmm.
change something about how we act, how others act.
Mm-hmm.
And the most obvious thing that needs to be changed is a state of urgency, where there's a state that is in some sense crying out to be changed.
Mm-hmm.
And those states are states of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So we know from our own experience that
Mm-hmm.
if we're experiencing extreme suffering,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so I mean, there's a whole scale of suffering, and
Yes.
some degrees, minor degrees of suffering just don't have much importance. So when I talk about suffering, I'm talking about, serious suffering. If we're in a state like that, it can absolutely consume our attention, and there becomes nothing more important in the world than to have that state of suffering alleviated. And by extension, if anyone else in the world, any other sentient being experiences that kind of state of extreme suffering, there's an inherent urgency to change things. And I think part of the problem that we're faced with is that the state of suffering can be fleeting. We may have experienced extreme suffering in the past. Hopefully not too much of it. Some people are more fortunate than others, but we tend to forget about it. We tend to forget what it was really like. And so I think in general, it doesn't affect our policy making and our priorities as much as it would if we fully took it into account.
So because you are involved in making sure that specific policies are changed in order to alleviate that suffering. Is that?
So okay, maybe I'll also go back to what I'm actually doing. So you asked me the question of why is suffering so important, and yes, I think it's inherently a state that cries out to be changed. Whereas a neutral state, or even a state of happiness, there's no inherent urgency to change something about it. This is what makes suffering very different from bliss. We may want to create lots of bliss in the world, but there's no urgent need to do it. Whereas when there's suffering, if we see somebody suffering, if we see a human or an animal suffering, we feel this a compulsion to do something about it, to come to the rescue.
Compassion. That's what compassion is. It's all about.
Exactly. Compassion is, I think this is how Paul Gilbert defines it. It's a state of caring about the suffering of someone else and wanting to do something.
Yeah. So it's not only about feeling it, and so noticing it and experiencing the feelings, but then actually doing something about it.
Right. Yeah. Right. So it's beyond just what does it do for me. It's about how can I actually act in the world to address. It's not about my own experience so much. It's ultimately about the experience of the other. I guess that's one way of looking at it. So, and if we familiarize ourselves, if we read accounts and watch films about some of the terrible things that have happened and that continue to happen in the world, and we try not to block it out because we find it overwhelming, we can become sort of very sensitized to this very basic need to do something about it. And so, I think in some ways it's obvious, and in other ways people tend to diminish its importance because there's this idea that, well, somehow suffering contributes to the meaning of life, and it can't be, it's just something that we have to put up with. I think in many cases, if people were exposed to certain types of suffering, they would change their view. And one example, for example, one important example is how animals are treated on factory farms. So it's just one source of suffering in the world, and there's obviously so much human suffering. But I talk about animal suffering, let's say non-human animal suffering, because it's so widespread and it's so it's so preventable. And, we're talking about animals that are kept in tiny cages where they can't turn around.
And we're desensitized to that. In the, I think the majority of us, we don't even think about it.
Yeah, because it's we're not immediately exposed to it.
Yes.
These are all things that happen conveniently out of the way. And we might see some videos and then we ignore them, or we think that, well, everybody else is ignoring it, so it seems that I have a license to do so as well. The book came out a few years ago now. What am I doing now? Well, one thing I did a few years ago was to set up a small organization, which I call a think and do tank, called OPUS, which is very self-explanatory. It's the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering. And the idea was to put some of the ideas into practice rather than just, keep writing books. Something very concrete to promote these ideas, to promote the ethic of non-suffering.
Think and do tank. That's a great name, by the way, not just a think tank.
Yeah. I'm not the first person to use the term, but there's the idea of thinking deeply about ethics and about policy, but then also looking for creative ways, ideally creative, to try to do things a little bit differently, to actually implement these ideas at the level of actual policy and politics. Because ultimately, if we want to have large scale, to affect large scale change, we need to be working at the political level. Everything eventually comes down to politics.
So what are your main areas of interest of preventing, alleviating suffering? Because that's what we've been discussing.
So in principle, we would take a very calculated approach to first determining what are the major causes of intense suffering, and which are the ones that are not currently being looked at enough, and which are the ones that we think we can have some concrete impact on. There's the effective altruism movement, which we're closely affiliated with.
Peter Singer.
Well, Peter Singer was one of the one of the big figures in the movement. Absolutely.
Effective altruism, yes. Instead of just keeping it theoretical, it's about the pragmatics of it, how practical it can be. Yeah.
How to be as effective as possible. So one set of measures for identifying causes that are worth focusing on is this triad of scale, neglectedness, and tractability. So just what I was saying, how big is it? How many people are affected, or how many animals are affected? How intense is the suffering? How many other organizations are working on this particular cause? And realistically, how much of an impact we think we can have. It may be that we think the chances of having impact are low, but we think that if we do have impact, we'll have a very large effect. So then there's also this sense of taking into account not just the risk, but also the potential output if well. So there are a lot of different causes that are worthy of attention. One cause that we, let's say, migrated towards was that of access to pain relief. So we were already aware there'd been some work that had been done to explore this cause area. So this was already, let's say, on our radar screen. And then this report came out a few years ago in the medical journal, The Lancet, talking about the huge disparities in access to morphine between developed countries and lower and middle income countries. So the timing felt right, and we decided that this was the time we were going to contribute to to raising awareness about this issue. So this was actually one of the first areas that we got, let's say, heavily involved in. We'd already been addressing things like animal rights, but that was more sort of social media stuff. But here we actually organized a an expert panel event at the UN Human Rights Council.
Mm-hmm.
And, we created an advocacy guide.
Mm-hmm.
So, we were contributing to the voices saying that people should have access to morphine if they need it.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be clear, we're talking here mainly about terminal cancer patients,
Okay.
though not only,
Mm-hmm.
and especially in lower income countries where
Mm-hmm.
morphine is often just not available because
Mm-hmm.
of bureaucratic issues, because
Mm-hmm.
of legal barriers, because doctors are not
Mm-hmm.
taught how to prescribe it,
Mm-hmm.
social taboos.
Hmm.
All every country is a little bit different, but
Mm-hmm.
there are a number of factors that make it very difficult
Mm-hmm.
for many patients who are often in terrible pain
Mm-hmm.
at the end of their lives to get morphine to make their last days bearable.
Hmm.
So after that initial activity, we ended up establishing a collaboration with the Palliative Care Association of Burkina Faso in
Mm.
West Africa.
Okay. Uh-huh.
So this was a chance to actually do some work really on the ground, because it's one thing to be in Geneva and
Mm-hmm.
organize some conference and you get a few
Yes.
people coming and you make a bit of noise.
Uh-huh.
But by actually doing something in a country that has a real problem with access,
Mm-hmm.
we hope that we were able to move things forward in terms of policy and in terms of education of doctors and so on. So we co-organized a conference
Mm-hmm.
together with the local Palliative Care Association and the Ministry of Health,
Mm-hmm.
and we crowdfunded a conference and worked on policy proposals, and things went really well. The timing was good because it was just before, it was at the beginning of December. A few months later, we couldn't have held it because of coronavirus.
Oh, yes, naturally.
And they have their hands full now in Burkina Faso with the coronavirus. So I'm not sure what we're on target to move things forward with palliative care. There were new proposals for legislation that we're probably going to go through. I guess right now they're probably focusing more on dealing with coronavirus. I think Burkina Faso is one of the hardest hit countries in sub-Saharan Africa,
Okay.
as far as I know. But anyways, these kinds of efforts need to be done at the country level, because every country obviously has its own healthcare system and its own priorities and its own laws. So everything needs to be, whatever's done in one country needs to be done in another with local partners. And here we just happen to have a local partner that was enthusiastic, and the collaboration just went very smoothly. So this is one area that we've been working on. Another area that we've started to focus on is also connected with pain relief, although it affects, let's say, a different segment of the population. And that is, and here we're talking about a condition called cluster headaches. Now, when you hear the word headache, you think, okay, well, headaches are bad, but they're not the end of the world.
Yes.
You might think of a migraine and think, well, migraine can be pretty bad. Cluster headaches are worse than migraines, and they're worse than childbirth. They're actually considered one of the most painful conditions known to medicine. Now, again, cluster headaches were on our radar screen, but we weren't doing anything about it. And then we found out through one of our advisors that there are certain hallucinogenic substances which seem to work extremely well in alleviating cluster headaches. Okay. So I didn't describe the condition entirely, but basically there are attacks that can last anywhere from 15 minutes to a few hours, and they can happen several times a day for months. And then usually they will stop, but they may be repeated a second time in the year. So there are these episodes, and they absolutely destroy people's lives. I mean, people will be woken up with terrible pains, and we're talking about pains. I mean, it's a pretty graphic description, but it's often described as having an ice pick stuck into the eye.
Mm.
I mean, it sounds absolutely awful, and
Mm.
and yeah, people's lives are just destroyed by it.
That's right. Yeah.
So there are medications available,
Mm-hmm.
but they do work, but they're
Mm.
not all effective all the time with everybody,
Okay.
and they have side effects. One of the
Mm-hmm.
most effective treatments is high flow oxygen, but
Mm.
again, that doesn't work with everyone, and it
Mm-hmm.
means that people have that equipment available.
Mm.
So, anyways, one of our advisors came across this
Mm.
information that
Mm-hmm.
one particular hallucinogen
Mm-hmm.
can relieve or abort an attack within
Mm-hmm.
seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So this got me very interested
Mm-hmm.
in exploring, what can be done. Maybe this is the answer to make sure that everybody can get access to it.
Mm.
And so we're still pursuing that idea, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a number of hallucinogens,
Mm-hmm.
things magic mushrooms,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
which contain
Mm-hmm.
psilocybin, which
Mm-hmm.
is being used increasingly, or it's
Mm-hmm.
being studied
Mm-hmm.
increasingly for treatment of things like post-traumatic stress disorder
Mm-hmm.
and depression. So there's an increasing awareness that some of these substances are useful for
Mm-hmm.
medical purposes. So basically what we're trying to do is to make sure that cluster headache patients get the best possible
Mm-hmm.
treatments available. So first of all, that doctors understand the
Mm-hmm.
condition, that they're able
Yeah.
to recognize it,
Mm-hmm.
and so that there isn't a lag time of several years before patients are diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
We want to provide the best information to patients, even information that they may not be getting from doctors,
Mm-hmm.
that's based on patients' own experience. And we want to work with governments to
Mm-hmm.
ensure that it's treated with the severity, with the importance, let's say,
Yeah. Okay.
necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And also lobby for changes in legislation, because this is a
Mm-hmm.
more general problem about drug laws, which
Mm-hmm.
is that the general approach to drugs
Mm-hmm.
is a criminal approach rather than a healthcare approach. So people that use drugs, even if if they don't represent any harm to anyone else, are often treated like criminals. And this is what's happening, or would be happening potentially with cluster headache patients who try to self-medicate
Mm-hmm.
to relieve their pain. So they may be using substances which may be better than anything they can get
Mm-hmm.
from the doctor,
Mm-hmm.
and that may have
Yes.
dramatic effects, but they're actually exposing themselves, depending on where they live, to being treated as criminals and having a criminal record. And this
Mm-hmm.
is obviously nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
People should not risk a criminal record for a victimless crime where there's
So,
nobody just trying to ease their own pain.
so are you trying to influence legislation,
Yes.
local regulations, and such?
Yes, so this
Okay.
is our plan, and
Yeah.
we've got some collaborations already with
Mm-hmm.
two cluster headache groups
Mm.
in the US and in Finland,
Okay.
and we're going to see what we can do to contact members of the government
Mm-hmm.
and the press,
Mm-hmm.
and raise awareness of the fact that there's this very, very evil condition.
Mm-hmm.
By making some small changes in policy, it might be possible to
Mm-hmm.
radically improve people's lives,
Mm-hmm.
actually prevent some people from committing suicide, because that's how bad it often gets.
Mm-hmm. So if you don't mind me asking, what's in it for you? So what's your personal interest? What made you become interested in these specific topics?
That's a good question. It's hard to pinpoint any one specific thing. I mean, I think I've had some sort of a sensitivity to it since to suffering since I was small. But when people ask me that, I usually mention the fact that I was exposed as a child to images from the Holocaust, and these were films that we were shown in elementary school even. I'm not sure if that would be. I'm not sure if those kinds of images would be considered age appropriate now, but they left a very strong impression on me. And I mean, to the fact that even today, sometimes if I see images like that, you know, it creates a real strong emotional response. But I didn't necessarily pursue a career with the idea of alleviating suffering in mind. Although at some point I did think I was going to become a medical doctor, and then I decided to pursue a career in biological research. Well, with the idea of trying to find treatments for cancer. So yeah, I mean, I did want to make a difference in some way. And I guess over the years, I became more conscious of suffering, and I suppose just becoming more aware of the reality of extreme suffering, and the fact that there's certain things that we should really try to prevent happening if at all possible.
So what keeps you going, Jonathan, if you don't mind me asking?
So that goes back to the beginning of our conversation. Let's say the thriving part. So
Yes,
some sort of balance. But in terms of the motivation, well, I mean, I guess the motivation can ebb and flow. So this is again a kind of a balance I think we need. If we immerse ourselves too much in suffering, it can become overwhelming. But if we don't expose ourselves to it or remind ourselves of it from time to time, we can lose a sense of that urgency. And that can happen to me as well. I can sometimes wonder, or why am I working on this? And then I can just read something or read something that a patient has written in a patient group on Facebook. I think, oh my God, this is terrible, and people don't know about it. And if we changed laws and so that people were not ostracized, or that we actually treated with the priority it deserves illnesses like that, the world would be so much better. So, it just feels like a natural thing to do. It's something I'm passionate about. And I'd rather be doing something that will make a difference to others than do something sort of not, something sort of secondary that doesn't leave some sort of a lasting effect.
So I'm really sorry to be asking this question, but how successful are you?
Okay. It depends, I guess, how you measure success.
Yeah, that's another question. That's true. So. So how do you define success, and then how's a successful based on that you think you are?
Well, one measure of success is obviously impact. I mean, if you want to take a very sort of a very consequentialist approach to thinking of success, is how much suffering am I actually managing to avert? Now, this is an interesting question, because then that relates to metrics.
Yeah, and how you measure it, how you measure suffering, and then the success of alleviating it.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, I mean, this is something which I think very few people agree on. How do you measure suffering, and how do you compare, let's say, alleviating the suffering of one person with a cluster headache compared to 10 people with suffering from moderate to severe pain due to cancer,
and suffering and pain. I had this conversation with Eric Cassell. I'm sure you're familiar with him. So he extensively writes on a renowned professor when it comes to pain and suffering. So what's the distinction between the two?
Well, yeah. I mean, pain is more specific than suffering. Pain and pain doesn't necessarily imply suffering in the usual sense. We may choose, for example, to experience certain things voluntarily for whatever reason, and that could involve pain. and yet it wouldn't necessarily be the suffering.
Yeah, it's like being in love, you know, falling in love. So that's, let's say, at times. Sorry to be interrupted.
Yeah, I might disagree with you about whether that involves suffering or not. I was thinking more about people who decide to climb a mountain in the winter.
Oh, okay, yeah.
In the Himalayas.
Well, same experience, really, Jonathan. Same experience. Let's be honest about it. In some cases, it is.
So I mean, I think you can sometimes dissociate pain from suffering. Generally, pain that isn't wanted, it creates suffering. It creates this desire to have it alleviated. And the same thing for emotional suffering. So usually we can split suffering into the physical and emotional, but they're related. I mean, they're both states of being that we prefer to avoid, or we may want very much to avoid. And I think there's also a physiological connection. So, for example, there's a woman who was reported on recently who's unable to feel pain. So she has some sort of genetic mutation that makes her constitutively unable to experience physical pain. And I mean, she looks pretty normal. It's not like she's got lots of broken bones and bruises. I mean, she's obviously less, she probably learns how to avoid damaging her body because she may not pick up the usual signs. But the point is that not only does she not feel physical pain, but she seems to be incredibly happy and good-natured. So there's obviously some sort of common pathway in the generation of the pain response and in emotional suffering. So suffering isn't just it's not just like a blanket term that we use for two different phenomena. In some ways, they're actually related at the physiological level.
So going back to the previous question of how successful are you?
Right. So
you think you are, yeah.
That remains to be seen. I mean, it's work in progress, and my goal is really to alleviate and to prevent as much future suffering as possible. So, Opus has only been around for 4 years, and we've become better known, and I'm hoping that through projects that we're working on now and in the future that we'll be able to not just alleviate the suffering of people and animals who are alive now, but that we'll be able to change the way decisions are made in society. So this is another aspect of what we are working on, and that's relating ethics to governance. So this is the more, let's say, ambitious project. Mind you, if we could wipe out the suffering of a lot of cluster headache patients, that would already be, I guess, is already pretty ambitious, and would be a great. That would definitely feel like a success. But if we're thinking how to make things like that a priority in terms of government decision making, that's sort of like another level up. How do we ensure that governments refer to a code of ethics that says, extreme suffering is just a no-go. We have to do what we can to prevent it from happening. And how can we influence decision makers? How can we try to shape the future of government by making these things, giving these things the importance that they deserve? And well, I mean, the world is in one more crisis now, but it's causing a lot of people to question the way our system works, the economics, the priorities that our leaders seem to have. And so people are thinking now increasingly that this is a time to try to change things.
Is that your opinion as well, Jonathan?
Yes. I think it's clear that when there are these big crises, it's an opportunity and a threat. It's a threat because some government leaders take advantage of the fact that people are distracted and in a state of chaos
Yes.
to take on greater power. And
like in Hungary or Poland, yes, we know.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's also an opportunity because it means that people are just are shaken up from their daily routine and are, I think, have more sort of quiet time and people are thinking about, this is not right. There are things that could have been done differently, but there are bigger problems in our actual system. It's not protecting people. So there's probably going to be a greater awareness now of the need, to create social safety nets, first of all. So, like looking after people economically, making sure that healthcare is properly funded. It also raises the whole question of the connection between animal agriculture and disease. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say that, somebody eating a piece of meat, in who knows where, so in the middle of Europe is causing some sort of, is increasing the likelihood of some sort of epidemic to break out. Let's just say that there are certain specific causes, but it also remains a fact that a lot of the viral epidemics do seem to be linked to animal agriculture. And there's another issue, which is that of antibiotic resistance, and that also is a result of practices that go on in factory farms all over the world, not just in China, but throughout the entire world, because animals are kept together in such tight conditions, and disease naturally breaks them. So they're fed large amounts of antibiotic. As a result of all that, there are strains of antibiotic resistant bacteria that are spreading, and the world risks running out of antibiotics. So, there is a link between our lifestyle and our dependence on animal agriculture and some of the diseases that we're facing. And it should, I think it should at least cause people to think about whether we should be doing things differently. Given the amount of suffering that is caused to animals, it seems like it's a good opportunity to rethink our whole diet. How can we live with greater compassion, and also in a way that represents less eventual harm to ourselves?
So what is what is compassion according to yourself, Jonathan? Another easy question. How would you define it or describe it?
Right. Well, so there is that definition that we talked about beforehand about caring for other people's suffering or the suffering of any other sentient being, and trying to do something about it. I think that's probably as useful a definition as there is. People are always talking about the difference between compassion and empathy and sympathy, and people can get very tied up on definitions.
Altruism,
Right. But it reminds me, for example, of the question of, is there enough empathy in the world? Do we need more empathy, or do we need to be more systematic? And I was thinking of Paul Bloom, who's written that book
Against Empathy.
Against Empathy.
Yeah.
And and I think there's something valuable in it, but I think probably he also overstates his message. So I think he's not saying that empathy is always a bad thing. He's saying that
it should be more rational.
It should be more rational.
About doing, not just feeling it.
Right, and also
how I understand it. Yeah.
Right, and also that there's a risk if we focus on those who are close to us.
Yes.
Let's say emotionally close to us.
Tribal empathy. Yeah.
Right. So we're more likely to try to alleviate suffering that is nearby rather than suffering that's farther away, where we might actually be able to have more impact. So in that respect, I think he's
Mm-hmm.
totally right. But I think that we still need to experience empathy, and empathy is basically the driving force behind compassion.
Mm.
So we need to feel that kind of
Mm-hmm.
emotion when exposed to the suffering of others. We need to feel this sense of, whether it's the kind of effective empathy where we we feel an immediate emotional reaction to seeing the suffering of another,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's of the cognitive type where we actually try to imagine what is it actually like for that other being,
Mentalizing, you mean?
mentalizing it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, we need some of that going on
Mm-hmm.
before we can, before we can, let's say, systematize. I mean, so we should probably be spending as much of our time
Mm-hmm.
trying to have as much impact as we can. But as I was saying earlier, I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important to refamiliarize ourselves with the things that we're trying to alleviate,
Mm-hmm.
and that probably requires feeling that kind of empathy from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Um, and it's also motivating to see that our efforts are having an impact. And even though we may be able to look at a list of numbers and see if the numbers are reducing, are being decreased, that represents impact.
Mm-hmm.
It's still emotionally a lot more compelling, just because of the way our brains work,
Mm-hmm.
to see the effect on an actual individual, and see that somebody has actually had the suffering alleviated due to our efforts.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there isn't any one specific
Mm-hmm.
individual.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it is just that we've reduced the overall percentage of a population that suffers, and so it is important that we're able to take take pride in a reduction of
Mm-hmm.
suffering on paper.
Mm-hmm.
But just because of the way the human brain works,
Mm-hmm.
I think people are always more motivated when they see that something that they've done, whether it's giving money or
Mm-hmm.
actually doing something, let's say, concrete,
Mm-hmm.
hands-on,
Mm-hmm.
does actually relieve the suffering of someone who would have suffered
Mm-hmm.
if not for these efforts.
Mm.
So, we're faced with the sort of the complexities of the human mind, that we are emotional creatures, and I don't think we shouldn't discard that there is that is simply how we function.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we need to also train ourselves to be more rational, and to think,
Mm-hmm.
in the end, reducing those numbers is going to mean that X number of humans
Mm-hmm.
or animals
Mm-hmm.
actually experience things we don't want them to experience.
Mm. So combining the affective, the emotional sphere with the rational dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. I
So
mean,
how,
that's what the effective altruism movement talks about: combining the head and the heart.
oh yeah.
And I think it's important also for how we communicate,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that we show people what it is that we're actually trying to achieve, that we generate an emotional reaction, because
Mm-hmm.
emotions are more motivating than just facts.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, you could say that facts are basically about numbers of
Mm-hmm.
individuals that are, I'm basically repeating what I just said before, which is that, we're geared towards tuning into the experience of one other being.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to combine it. We need to combine that feeling of caring
Mm-hmm.
with that
Mm-hmm.
concern for helping as many as possible.
Mm. So where do you see yourself and your organization in the next few years, say 5 or 10?
Um, I have no idea about 10 years. I'm not even sure about 5 years. I'm not even thinking necessarily in those terms. I'm thinking,
Mm-hmm.
how can we move things forward from where we are
Okay.
now? I don't know what the world will even look like in 5 years.
Mm.
Yeah, and there's so many things that are hard to predict. What I am trying to do is to stick with the core ideas
Mm-hmm.
and to look for ways of influencing other people.
Mm-hmm.
Influencing in the sense of just showing them, look, this is, these are the ethics, this is the
Mm-hmm.
argumentation, this is the reality that we're trying to address.
Mm-hmm.
And looking for influencers to, let's say, to influence,
Mm-hmm.
to join with other
Mm-hmm.
organizations, to influence the way policy making is done.
Mm. So do you think
And
it's utopia, or is it the other type, starting which starts with an E rather than U?
um, I think we have to aim high.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's really the only place to aim.
Mm.
And I think it's okay to have a utopian vision.
Mm-hmm.
It motivates us, and even if we don't get all the way there
Mm-hmm.
in any particular generation,
Mm.
it keeps us pointed in the right direction.
Mm. So it's beyond our individual selves, in a way.
Well, we want to see results
Mm-hmm.
in the short term. Everyone's
Mm-hmm.
asking for results in the short term.
Yes.
And in our generation, we want to be able to point to our successes.
Mm.
And I think, if you want to influence things in the future, in the far future, that will happen through things that we do today.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it is important to keep an eye on the long term as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this part of the effective altruism movement is focusing on the long term future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm.
some people are more concerned with things like avoiding existential risk,
Mm-hmm.
and others are concerned with avoiding
Mm-hmm.
catastrophic amounts of suffering. And there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of overlap as well, because there are a lot of bad things that could happen that
Mm-hmm.
could threaten the future of humanity, but
Mm-hmm.
that could also cause a huge amount of suffering. So I think somehow we need to find a way of working towards a common cause of really trying to eradicate extreme suffering on our planet, while still retaining a compelling vision of what the world could be like.
Mm.
I think that will keep us motivated and inspired, and at the
Mm.
same time not have us not lose track of one of the things that really matters the most.
Mm.
And in my opinion, that does matter the most, which is to
Mm-hmm.
eradicate extreme suffering.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and we can see how interconnected we are, and well, especially now the coronavirus. That there is not the one nation, and the borders do not help us.
Yeah.
This is very tangible.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a common enemy to get people to cooperate.
Yeah.
And then the question is, can we, when the enemy disappears or
Mm-hmm.
goes to hiding, can we maintain this
Mm.
sense of cooperation?
Yeah, and urgent. Well, yes, and how and being aware of how urgent it is, and well, personally, I believe that only suffering makes us learn and changes us, but that in most cases it doesn't. So and for the majority of us, it doesn't. So
Well, I
yeah,
think what
quite
happens is
tricky. Yeah.
people, when the suffering goes away, when the threat goes away, people want to
Mm.
play.
Mm.
We want to go back to our normal lives. We want normality.
Mm. Mm.
So it's kind of human nature. But I mean, that's why it's in a way such an important opportunity now to use this unique situation that we're faced with.
Mm.
People
Mm.
spending weeks at home and
Mm.
wondering about the way the world works, and how we can get it to work differently. I think it's an opportunity that we need to use. I mean, who knows how long this particular threat is going to be with us, but if it's
Mm-hmm.
there will be future threats, and
Mm-hmm.
we need to be better prepared in the future. But
Mm-hmm.
more fundamentally, we need to rethink our priorities as a society. What are the things that we just don't want to happen? And one of them is having patients die in a pretty horrible way because there just isn't enough medical equipment or medical personnel. Very tangible example, and it's at times like that people take suffering more seriously because it concerns ourselves, it concerns people close to us. So it can help us to recalibrate our priorities.
So one last question, Jonathan.
Yeah.
So how important do you think mind training is? And I don't necessarily refer to things like formal practices, let's say meditation. Or to make it more personal, how do you maintain a certain state of mind in order for yourself to continue what you do?
Well, I'm really not an expert on maintaining, let's say, a perfectly stable state of mind from one day to the next. And when you asked me to write an article for the Mindfulness magazine, I put my own experience and ideas into that article. And I think it's really just simple things. It's creating triggers for myself. It could be listening to certain kinds of music. It could be meditation music, but it could also be listening to music that has a certain influence on to get me into a certain frame of mind. I do that sometimes. I wish I had a little bit more stability in that, but I know some days I wake up full of inspiration. The world feels just like a more beautiful place, and other days are just completely different. So I haven't totally mastered that, but I think a certain amount of stability and physical well-being, looking after oneself, going for walks. That's what does it for me. It's going for walks and listening to music and connecting with people, having good conversations. Those are the things that inspire me.
Yeah, that's actually why we're having this conversation, because I'm doing it for myself as well. So, so thank you for being an inspiration.
Well, thanks for inviting me to speak with you. It's always great. It's always great to connect with you.
Yeah, but because I think it's wonderful when we learn about people like yourself and their activities. That's why I said it was an inspiration, because it is, and inspiring us to do our bit. Let's say this tiny,
I think
input.
we all have a bit that we can play in this world, and some of us are working with ideas and influencing, and a lot of people are doing sort of absolutely essential work. You think of the healthcare workers that are just giving so much of their life force and their energy to try to help people. We're all just playing sort of different roles and using whatever we think we can do best to try to change things. Yeah.
So, thank you, Jonathan, and I will stop the recording now. And,
okay. Thanks, Julia. It's great talking to you.
Yes, likewise, and have a lovely, lovely evening, and hope the coronavirus goes away quickly for yourself and others. And
let's hope we can squash it.
So.